same file will save as and will give as a your ID selector. Okay, we'll change this is ID selector. Okay, ID selector. So how we want in ID selector? Same way I'll take this one also, file, and we'll just save as. We'll just write ID css.css. Okay. So now in ID selector, we have already learned that you have to use some ID here when you use the paragraph tag. Okay. Whenever you are going to define, you have to define the ID, like which ID the particular, because why we are going to use the ID selector? I want to specific, because what will happen here, if suppose I have another h1 tag. Okay, let's take another h1 tag. Okay, and I will define your same way. Next line h1. This is my ID selector 2. Okay, this is ID selector. Okay, save it. Sorry. We have to change this CSS, ID CSS. So you can see here, I'm using h1 when it's going to, because it is not taking ID. It is taking the universal only. That is what we have learned just previous one, that is the element selector. Now we have to use with the ID. When you are going to use with ID, then you have to define the each element different ID. Okay, so we have to define now. So what I'll do, go to the CSS, use as symbol, use hash symbol, use hash symbol. Okay, so whenever you are creating the selector, you are going to use the body. You can leave. Let it see that what will happen. So see, nothing is get changed because now it's came to the earlier stage how we have defined. There is no, because CSS rule has still not applied because we have not called this ID. Now see, this is the one h1. Okay, but again same h1 you have to define with different name. You should not always use h1. I will use here that like he1. Okay, for heading 1 I'll just copy this, I'll paste same tag, and I'll give here he2, heading 2, and this I'll remove this font family here now, and I'll change this color to orange. Okay, now that's all. Now let's come to the, after this writing the CSS, now come to the same thing. I just added here one hash symbol for every CSS. Now we have to call this with the paragraph 1. I'll give like this. Okay, now we'll come to here. Now we have h1. Hope you remember that when you are going to use ID selector, you have to define your ID. So what ID you have to give? ID. What is the ID name we have given for h1? That is he1. Okay, save it. The same way we have here heading 1 ID, and we have he2. The same way we have paragraph ID, and for paragraph what we have defined for p1, that is p1. For division we have used div1. Okay, now save it and let's execute. Where here we go. So this is the output. We have not implemented so far the for okay. So this is that. padding we have moved to 0. Now you can see that, right? If you go to the CSS rule, our heading 1 is color red and font is this one. You can see the color is red, font is this one. For paragraph, I'm using color blue. So color blue is there. We have another heading tag, which is using the orange color, and division tag with this. So this is your example of your ID selector. So you have to call with the ID selector.